The moment Silas Mercer realized he wasn't alone in the forest, the temperature dropped so suddenly that his breath crystallized mid-exhale, hanging in the air like frozen confession. The footsteps behind him had stopped. That was worse than when they'd been moving. For 3 hours now, ever since sunset swallowed the Oregon wilderness in darkness absolute, something had been pacing him through the undergrowth. Not parallel, not exactly following, matching. Every step he took, it took. Every pause it mirrored. The sound was wrong, too deliberate, too measured, like someone walking who'd forgotten what walking felt like and had to remember each movement separately. Silas had tried everything, sprinting until his lungs screamed, standing motionless for 20-minute eternities, even calling out into the void with a voice that didn't sound like his own anymore. The footsteps never faltered, never rushed, never answered. Just continued that metronomic rhythm 10 paces back, always 10 paces, through terrain so dark he couldn't see his own hands. His flashlight had died an hour ago. His phone had lost signal at dusk. And now, in this terrible silence where the footsteps had ceased, Silas understood something that made his knees buckle. The presence hadn't stopped because it had lost interest. It had stopped because it had arrived exactly where it wanted to be, right behind him. Close enough that he could feel the displacement of air that shouldn't exist, the cold that radiated from nothing, the weight of attention from eyes that had no business looking at the living. When he finally found the courage to turn around, his body moving with the resistance of nightmare logic, he saw what had been following him, and he realized with horror that flooded his mind like ice water. It had always been him. The same flannel jacket, the same hiking boots, the same face except hollow, except wrong, except wearing an expression of such desperate recognition that it shattered something fundamental in his understanding of what death meant. The specter's mouth moved, forming words that came out as wind through dead leaves. I've been trying to warn you for 7 years. If you connect with my story, please press the like button to find some light in this priest's heart. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next life stories, and tell me about them in the comments where you are watching this video and what time it is right now. It makes me very happy to know that from any corner of the country or the world, you are listening to me. The forests of Oregon hold memories like water holds cold. Some things sink deep, settling into the sediment of moss and Douglas fir root systems, fermenting in darkness until they become something else entirely. Silas Mercer had been one of those things for longer than he could properly calculate. Time moved differently when you existed between heartbeats, when your consciousness flickered in and out like a campfire struggling against rain. He'd been 32 years old when his body stopped working, when the fall from Eagle Creek Ridge had turned him from a graduate student researching old-growth ecosystem relationships into something that couldn't quite leave. The living Silas, the one with warm blood and a dissertation deadline, had died instantly, they said. The coroner's report was clean. Blunt force trauma, accidental death, case closed. But the version of Silas that remained, the echo that still walked these trails in eternal twilight, knew the truth was more complicated. Death wasn't an ending here. It was a transformation, a terrible promotion into a role he'd never applied for. Guardian, witness, warning. The forest had made him into something between ghost and angel, between vengeance and mercy. And tonight, after 7 years of haunting these woods, after 7 years of trying to protect the living from the mistakes that had killed him, he'd finally found himself, his own body alive and breathing, making the same journey toward the same fatal cliff edge. The paradox made his spectral form flicker, like a fluorescent bulb struggling to stay lit, but Silas held himself together through sheer desperate will. He had one chance to change what he'd always believed was inevitable. One chance to save himself. One chance to break the cycle that the forest had locked him into. And all he had to do was make the living version of himself believe the impossible. That death was already walking beside him, wearing his face, counting his steps. The living Silas, and how strange it felt to think of himself that way, to bifurcate his identity into alive and dead, stood frozen on the trail, his headlamp casting a weak beam that passed straight through the spectral version of himself, like light through smoke. The apparition shimmered and reformed, struggling to maintain cohesion, and the ghost Silas felt the familiar frustration of existence without substance. 7 years he'd tried to master this, tried to make himself solid enough to push people off dangerous paths, tried to make his voice carry weight instead of just whistling through the spaces between atoms. 7 years, and he could still barely manage to be seen, let alone heard. "You're not real," the living Silas whispered, but his voice cracked on the last word. "Heat exhaustion, dehydration. I read about this in survivor accounts. The mind creates—" "You're going to die in 47 minutes, the ghost interrupted. And this time his voice came through clearer, carried on a wind that didn't exist. "At 9:47 p.m., exactly. The trail marker ahead is loose. You'll lean against it for a photo of the valley overlook. The wood is rotted through from the inside, carpenter ants and dry rot from the unseasonably warm winter. It'll snap. The cliff edge is 130 feet of empty air, and then basalt rock that doesn't care about graduate students or ecosystem research, or the fact that you finally worked up the courage to tell Rebecca you love her. The specificity stopped the living Silas cold. Those weren't the wandering details of hallucination. Those were facts, precise and terrible, delivered with the exhausted authority of someone who'd lived or unlived through them. "Rebecca," the living Silas breathed. "How do you know about Rebecca? Because she's the last thing I thought about. Her laugh, that thing she does where she tucks her hair behind her ear when she's concentrating on field samples. The way she smells like pine sap and coffee. All of it flashing through your consciousness in the 3-7 seconds it takes to fall." The ghost moved closer, and the living Silas could see details now that made his stomach turn. The flannel shirt torn at the shoulder, exactly where his own was starting to fray. The left hiking boot with the red lace he'd replaced just yesterday. The wedding ring on a chain around the neck that he'd been carrying since his grandmother died. "I am you, Silas. 7 years from now, and 7 years ago, and happening right now, all at once. Time doesn't work right when you're dead. It's all just simultaneous." A branch cracked somewhere in the darkness beyond their bubble of confrontation. Both versions of Silas turned toward the sound, but where the living man saw only impenetrable black, the ghost could perceive the layered realities of the forest, the physical world of bark and stone, the emotional residue of 1,000 hikers' fears and joys, and beneath it all, something else, something that moved with purpose and hunger, something that had been feeding on deaths like his for longer than the trees had been standing. "We need to move," the ghost said urgently. "There's something I haven't told you, something I didn't understand until I'd been dead for 3 years and started seeing the patterns. You think your death was an accident? I thought it was an accident, but accidents don't repeat themselves with this kind of precision. Every 7 years someone falls from Eagle Creek Ridge, always at night, always alone, always someone with unfinished business in their heart." He reached out with a hand that was more concept than flesh, trying to grasp his living self's shoulder. His fingers passed through, but the living Silas shuddered at the touch, feeling cold that went deeper than temperature, straight into marrow and memory. "We're being hunted." The living Silas wanted to run. Every rational impulse screamed at him to dismiss this as psychotic break or carbon monoxide poisoning from his camp stove, or any explanation that didn't involve conversing with his own corpse. But rationality had limits, and those limits were defined by the absolute sincerity in his doppelganger's eyes that reflected firelight that wasn't there, that had seen things eyes shouldn't see and survived it in the worst possible way. "What's hunting us?" he asked, and in asking crossed a threshold he couldn't uncross. Belief, terrible, complete belief. The ghost Silas turned toward the deeper forest, toward slopes that climbed into ancient growth where the canopy blocked out even starlight. Her name was Margot Chen. She was the park ranger here for 33 years, and when she died in 1987, she decided she wasn't finished with this place, wasn't finished collecting. As if summoned by her name, the forest changed. The ambient temperature plummeted another 10 degrees. The darkness somehow darkened, becoming textured, almost solid, and from somewhere upslope came a sound that the living Silas first mistook for wind, then recognized with primitive horror as breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing, the kind that comes before a predator strikes. "Run," the ghost whispered. "We run now, and I'll explain while we move." But Silas... He locked eyes with his living self, and in that moment they were truly one person, separated only by the thinnest membrane of mortality. Whatever happens, don't leave the trail. The moment you step off the path, she can touch you. And once she touches you, you don't get to be a ghost like me, you just get to be gone. They ran. The living Silas crashed through underbrush with the graceless panic of prey, while his spectral counterpart flowed alongside like mist, occasionally solidifying enough to gesture directions. Left around that deadfall, right past the Douglas fir with the lightning scar, straight through the clearing where foxfire glowed on rotting logs. Behind them the breathing grew closer, accompanied now by footsteps that sounded wrong. Too many legs, or not enough, striking ground in rhythms that shouldn't exist. Margot Chen loved this forest, the ghost panted, even though he no longer needed breath. The habit was too ingrained to break. Loved it so much she couldn't stand watching people destroy it. Careless hikers leaving trash, developers eyeing old growth for timber. Even researchers like you, like us, cataloguing and measuring and reducing mystery to data. They vaulted over a stream that the living Silas didn't remember crossing on his hike in. When she died, heart attack at her ranger station, alone on a February night, she made a choice. She bound herself to this place, made herself its guardian, its enforcer. "But I'm not here to hurt the forest," the living Silas gasped. His lungs were burning, his legs trembling from hours of hiking compounded by terror. "My research is about preservation, about understanding ecosystem interdependence. She doesn't care about your intentions. She cares about your presence." In her mind, the only way to truly protect the wilderness is to keep it empty, and every 7 years when the barrier between worlds thins, she takes someone, feeds them to the forest, adds their death to its defense. The ghost stopped abruptly, holding up a hand. The living Silas skidded to a halt, nearly toppling forward. They'd reached a small clearing ringed by western red cedars, so old they remembered when the first humans walked here. Moonlight, previously blocked by dense canopy, illuminated the space in silver-blue unreality. In the center of the clearing stood a woman who looked exactly as Margot Chen had in her final photo, the one they'd mounted in the ranger station as memorial. 67 years old, hair steel gray and pulled back in a practical bun, wearing the old-style Park Service uniform with brass buttons and a campaign hat. She would have looked distinguished, even noble, if not for her eyes. They were completely black, not the black of normal pupils, but the black of absolute void, of spaces between stars, of endings without echo. "Silas Mercer," she said, and her voice came from everywhere and nowhere, resonating in tree bark and stone and the living Silas's own bones. "You're early. I wasn't expecting you for another 23 minutes. "He knows," the ghost Silas said, stepping between his living self and the ranger thing. "I warned him. He's not going to the ridge. You can't have him." Margot smiled, and it was the worst thing the living Silas had ever seen. "Oh, sweetheart, you still don't understand how this works. I've already had him. 7 years ago, the moment he fell, his death echoed backward and forward through time, creating you." She gestured at the ghost. "You think you're protecting him. You are him. You're the death that's already happened, walking around pretending it can change fate. It's almost precious." The ghost flickered, his form destabilizing. "No, that's not. There has to be a way to break the cycle. I've been trying for 7 years. Yes, I know. I've watched you stumble around these woods, confused and desperate, trying to warn the living, trying to prevent what's already written in the rings of every tree here." Margot moved forward, and though she walked on solid ground, the earth beneath her feet withered, moss turning grey and brittle. "But here's what you haven't figured out yet. You're not separate from me. You're part of what I do. Every ghost I make becomes a warning that no one heeds, a guard dog that can't bite, a sentry that only makes the forest more terrifying. You've helped me more than you know." The living Silas felt reality tilting, felt the logic of nightmare overwhelming the logic of biology and physics. His dead self, trying to save him, was actually part of the trap. The warning was the mechanism. And somewhere in the next 23 minutes, despite everything, he was supposed to fall. "There's someone else," a small voice said from the edge of the clearing. "There's always someone else." They all turned. Standing at the tree line, half hidden in shadow, was a boy of about 9 years old. He wore modern clothes, superhero t-shirt, light-up sneakers, but he had the same black void eyes as Margot Chen. Dewey Fletcher, the ghost Silas remembered with sudden, horrified clarity. Missing since 2004. Never found. Declared dead in absentia after 7 years. Smart boy, Margot said approvingly. Show them. Dewey stepped into the moonlight, and behind him came others, a teenage girl in 1990s grunge fashion, an elderly man in 1970s hiking gear, a woman in a 1960s Peace Corps jacket. More and more, dozens of them, all with those terrible empty eyes, all radiating the same wrong energy as Margot. An army of the taken, bound to the forest, transformed from victims into accomplices. Every 7 years, Margot repeated, each death makes the forest stronger, makes me stronger, and each ghost thinks they can break the pattern, save themselves, change fate. They all fail. You'll fail. And 7 years from now, there will be 3 of you trying to warn the next Silas Mercer, and 7 years after that 4, until there are so many versions of you haunting these woods that the living will never come here again. The forest will finally be safe. Finally, be pure. The ghost Silas looked at his living self, and in his eyes the living Silas saw something he hadn't expected. Not despair, but determination. She's wrong, the ghost said quietly. About one thing. I'm not just a warning. I'm a choice. Every moment of the last 7 years I could have given up, let myself dissipate, accepted oblivion. But I didn't. I stayed. I kept walking these trails. I kept learning. And 3 years ago, I met someone who taught me that death isn't the end of agency. There's no one else out here, Margot snapped, and for the first time uncertainty flickered across her face. I would have felt... You felt what you expected to feel, a new voice said, and from the opposite side of the clearing stepped a woman the living Silas recognized from his trail research. Elena Vasquez, current park ranger, 34 years old, decorated for her search and rescue work. But Elena wasn't alone. She was carrying equipment that looked distinctly non-standard, bundles of sage copper wire wrapped in specific patterns, and a beaten journal that the living Silas somehow knew was important. Margot, Eleanor said, her voice steady despite facing down an army of the dead. It's time to let them go. The ranger thing snarled, and the sound was nothing human, nothing that had ever been human. You have no authority here. This is my forest, my vigil, your prison, Elena interrupted, because you never understood the difference between loving something and controlling it. You bound yourself here out of love, yes, but love twisted by fear becomes possession, and possession is just another word for haunting. She opened the journal, and the living Silas saw pages filled with names, dates, and intricate symbols. I've been documenting the pattern for 6 years, every disappearance, every unexplained death, every ghost sighting. And I found the loophole you created without realizing it. Margot's form began to distort, becoming less human and more like a storm system, a concentration of rage and grief and possessive devotion so intense it warped the air around her. There is no loophole. Death is final. Death is final, Elena agreed. But choice isn't. Every 7 years, you take someone, but every 7 years, that person's ghost stays behind, trying to change fate. You've been creating a network of resistance without realizing it. Silas here, she gestured at the ghost, isn't the first one to fight back. He's just the first one who's had enough time and enough help to understand what needs to happen. The ghost, Silas nodded slowly. The others, the ones you took before me, they're still here. Not all of them surrendered to you. From the forest came new presences. These didn't have Margot's black void eyes. They flickered and struggled to maintain form, but their eyes reflected starlight and moonlight and the faint, stubborn gleam of hope against darkness. The teenage girl from 1990 stepped forward, her grunge flannel different from the one standing with Margot, this version clean, not corrupted. Sarah Kimball, died 1993. I've been holding on, waiting. An old man in yellow rain gear. Dutch Morrison, 1986, still here. A young woman with a camera around her neck. Yuki Tanaka, 2000. Waiting for the right moment. More and more matching each of Margot's collected dead with their uncorrupted selves, versions that had somehow resisted transformation, hidden themselves in the forest's deeper layers, preserved their humanity through sheer stubborn will. "It's not about changing the past," the ghost Silas said to his living self. "I can't save you from falling. That already happened, but I can offer you a choice about what happens after." The living Silas felt the weight of predestination pressing down on him. "I'm still going to die tonight." "Yes, but not in 23 minutes, and not alone, and not to feed Margot's twisted vision of protection." The ghost reached out again, and this time when his hand touched the living Silas's shoulder, it made contact. Solid. Real. "We're going to walk to Eagle Creek Ridge together. You're going to take that photo for Rebecca. The rail is going to break. You're going to fall. And in the 7 seconds between ground and impact, you're going to have to make the most important choice of your death. Surrender to Margot's forest, or join us in freeing it." Margot shrieked, and the sound shattered trees, sent avalanches of needles cascading from branches. "You can't. I won't allow—" "You don't have authority anymore," Elena said firmly. She opened the journal to a specific page and began reading words in a language that predated English, predated the Chinook people who'd first named this land, words that belonged to the forest itself. "Every death you claimed gave you power, yes, but it also gave them power, the power to witness, to remember, to choose differently. And tonight, with both versions of Silas present, the cycle breaks." The corrupted ghosts began to flicker, Margot's control over them weakening. The uncorrupted versions moved forward, and the living Silas watched in awe as they reached out to their darker selves, touched them, merged with them. Each reunion sparked like a small sun, light blazing as division became wholeness, as the part that had surrendered to darkness reconciled with the part that had clung to light. "No," Margot whispered, but her voice was fading, losing its terrible resonance. "The forest needs protection. Humans destroy. They always destroy." "Humans are part of the forest," Elena said gently. "We evolved here, we belong here. The destruction you fear comes from disconnection, from forgetting that we're woven into the same ecosystem as the Douglas firs and the spotted owls. But you can't protect connection by creating separation. You can't preserve life by dealing death." The ghost Silas looked at his living self. "Ready?" The living Silas thought about Rebecca, about his research, about all the years he wouldn't get to live, all the coffee-scented mornings and pine-sap afternoons he'd never experience. The grief was overwhelming, a tidal wave of loss for a future that would never exist. But underneath the grief was something else. Curiosity, the same force that had made him into a scientist, that had driven him into these woods in the first place. The question, what comes next? "I'm ready," he said. They walked together through Margot's disintegrating army, through the clearing where moonlight battled with shadow, into the forest that had become both cathedral and coffin. Eleanor followed, still reading from the journal, her voice steady as she wove something new into the old pattern. The freed ghosts flanked them, a procession of the dead protecting the not yet dead, all moving toward the same destination. Eagle Creek Ridge rose before them like a black wall against the star-scattered sky. The trail marker stood exactly where it had always been, weathered wood and faded paint, looking deceptively solid. The valley stretched out below, invisible in darkness but present as negative space, an absence waiting to be filled. "When I die," the living Silas said, "what happens to you? If I become a ghost, and you're already my ghost—" "I don't know," the ghost admitted. "Maybe we merge. Maybe I finally get to rest. Maybe we create some new thing that's never existed before. But whatever happens, you won't be alone, and you won't be trapped. That's the choice, that's what changes everything." The living Silas pulled out his phone for one last photo, though he knew the darkness would render it meaningless. It wasn't about the image. It was about the ritual, about honoring Rebecca even in this impossible moment, about being fully present in his own death. He leaned against the rail. It broke. And in the 7 seconds of falling, Silas Mercer, both versions, living and dead, merging into something that transcended either state, made his choice. He opened himself to the forest, not as Margot's possession, but as participant. He joined the freed ghosts, not as warning, but as witness. He became part of the cycle not to perpetuate death, but to transform it into something new, memory with agency, past with purpose, ending that could still create beginning. His body hit the basalt rock at 9:47 p.m. exactly, just as predicted. But what rose from that impact wasn't another of Margot's corrupted servants. It was something the forest had never seen before, a ghost who chose his own haunting, who carried both the weight of loss and the lightness of liberation. Margot screamed one final time, her form dissolving into mist that the dawn wind would scatter. The forest shuddered, releasing 70 years of accumulated grief and possession. The corrupted ghosts, no longer bound, faded into peace or merged with their freed selves, or simply moved on to whatever came after. Elena Vasquez found Silas Mercer's body 3 days later, exactly where it should have been. She wrote her report with professional precision, noting every detail. Accidental death, case closed. But in her personal journal, the one she'd never show anyone, she wrote, "Another one freed. The forest breathes easier. 37 more cycles to break if my calculations are correct. But tonight, for the first time in 70 years, someone died here by accident instead of by design. That's progress." Ghost Silas, now unified and whole in a way that transcended simple resurrection, stood at the ridge looking down at his broken body. He felt Rebecca's grief like a wound that would never fully close, felt the research that would never be completed, felt every stolen year like a phantom limb. But he also felt the forest breathing around him, no longer oppressive but alive, truly alive, with all the death and rebirth that life required. He felt the other freed ghosts settling into their new existence, no longer soldiers in Margot's war, but simply souls who'd learned that even death could be a kind of dwelling. He felt Elena's determination, her commitment to breaking every remaining cycle, to freeing every ghost still trapped by Margot's last vestiges of influence. And he felt something he hadn't expected. Possibility. Death hadn't ended his agency. It had transformed it. He couldn't go back to Rebecca, couldn't finish his degree, couldn't live the life he'd planned. But he could do something else. He could be what Margot had tried and failed to be, a true guardian of this place, protecting not through isolation but through connection, warning not just about physical dangers but about spiritual ones, helping the living understand that the wilderness wasn't separate from them but part of them. The footsteps that would follow the next night hiker wouldn't be predatory anymore. They'd be protective. They'd be a reminder that the forest held more than trees and stone, that it was layered with stories and sorrows and second chances for those willing to listen. 7 years from now, another hiker would come to these woods. Maybe they'd be in danger, maybe not. But when they heard footsteps matching their own in the darkness, when they turned to see what followed, they wouldn't find a warning of their own death. They'd find Silas Mercer, eternally 32, eternally curious, ready to share what he'd learned in the country between living and dying. That the forest remembers everything. That love can corrupt when it forgets to let go. That death is transformation, not termination. That every ending is secretly a door if you're brave enough to walk through it. That the footsteps following you through the dark might not be hunting you. They might just be trying to make sure you don't walk alone. And sometimes, in the deepest nights when the barrier between worlds grows thin, hikers in the Oregon wilderness report encounters they can't explain. A man in a flannel shirt appearing from nowhere, offering directions that save lives. A presence that walks alongside them through dangerous passages, steady as starlight. Footsteps that match their own, not threatening but companionable. The rhythm of one heart keeping time with another across the divide of mortality. They call it the Eagle Creek Guardian. Some think it's just wind and wishful thinking. Others know better. They've felt the touch of cold that carries warmth at its core, heard the voice that whispers warnings about loose rails and hidden drops, and the importance of telling people you love them while you still can. Elena Vasquez knows the truth, carries it in her journal alongside 70 years of death and the slow, patient work of undoing it. She hikes these trails regularly now, mapping the places where Margot's influence still lingers. documenting the gradual healing of a forest that learned to breathe again. Sometimes she catches glimpses of Silas, sometimes of the others who've chosen to stay and guard rather than move on or fade away. She doesn't interfere. She just witnesses, records, and occasionally leaves offerings, sage bundles at certain trees, copper wire wound in protective patterns, pages torn from her journal with names of the lost and found. The forest has become something new, something it maybe always was but forgot during Margot's reign, a place of both danger and wonder, where death exists not as punishment but as transformation, where the past doesn't trap the present but illuminates it, where ghosts aren't prisoners but participants in an ongoing story that has no final chapter, only new verses being written in moonlight and morning mist, and the eternal rustle of Douglas fir needles in wind that carries voices from beyond. Silas walks his eternal patrol, and in walking finds purpose that survival alone could never have provided. He's become part of the ecosystem he came to study, woven into the food web not as prey or predator, but as something else entirely. Consciousness that persists, memory that acts, love for a place so deep it transcends the boundary of flesh. When Rebecca finally came to scatter his ashes, the official ones, the ones the crematorium provided, she swore she felt someone walking beside her. Someone who smelled like pine sap and coffee, who made the air feel less empty, who stayed with her all the way to the ridge and back again, ensuring she didn't stumble, didn't fall, didn't become another tragedy in a place that had held too many. She didn't see him, but she felt him, and in feeling understood something that grief had obscured, that Silas hadn't really left. He'd just changed his relationship to leaving, had found a way to stay that didn't require breathing or bleeding or any of the machinery of life. He'd become permanent in the way that stories are permanent, that love is permanent, that the deep roots of old trees are permanent, not eternal exactly, but enduring enough that the difference stops mattering. The Oregon forests hold memories like water holds cold. Some things sink deep and ferment into something transformative. Some deaths echo backward and forward through time, creating patterns that look like fate, but are really just choices made and unmade and remade until they become something new. Some footsteps follow not to frighten, but to accompany, to remind the living that they're never as alone as darkness makes them feel. And some ghosts, having died the deaths they were always going to die, discover that dying was just the beginning of the most important work they'd ever do. The work of bearing witness. The work of offering choice in the face of destiny. The work of transforming a forest from a place of possession into a place of partnership, where the dead and living exist not as separate kingdoms, but as different octaves of the same ongoing song. Silas Mercer died at 9:47 p.m. on an October night when the moon was 3 days from full. But what emerged from that death was something the forest had been waiting for without knowing it was waiting. A guardian who understood that true protection comes not from preventing all harm, but from walking alongside those in danger, offering wisdom without demanding obedience, illuminating paths without forcing travelers to take them. The footsteps that followed him all night, his own footsteps, echoing across the timeline of his existence, had been trying to teach him something, that he was never separate from his death, that the ghost and the living were always the same person, just experiencing different moments of the same unbroken story, that the cycle could only break when he stopped trying to prevent his own death and started accepting what he could become through it. Now those footsteps follow others, but their nature has changed. They're no longer the sound of hunting or warning. They're the sound of accompaniment, of presence, of a 32-year-old graduate student who never got to finish his dissertation, but who learned something far more important in the classroom of his own mortality. That the wilderness isn't something to control or even protect in the traditional sense. It's something to participate in, to honor, to allow to be wild, even when wildness includes death and danger, and all the sharp edges that make beauty and terror indistinguishable. The Oregon forests hold this knowledge in their root systems, in their mycorrhizal networks, in the way decay feeds growth, and growth feeds decay in the eternal wheel of transformation. And now they hold Silas Mercer too, not as prisoner or possession, but as partner, as one more voice in the great chorus of existence that includes crow call and creek song and the whisper of fir needles in wind that has traveled uninterrupted from the Pacific coast. Sometimes hikers still report footsteps. Sometimes they see a figure in a flannel shirt, appearing from fog or twilight or the space between thoughts. Most don't understand what they're experiencing. They chalk it up to fear or imagination or the brain's tendency to create pattern from chaos. But a few, the ones who really listen, who understand that listening requires more than ears, they hear the message that Silas and the others are trying to convey, that the forest is not separate from human experience, but woven through it. That death is not the opposite of life, but its continuation in a different key. That every ending contains the seed of beginning, if you're willing to plant it in the dark soil of acceptance and water it with the tears of genuine grief. That sometimes when you hear footsteps following you through the Oregon wilderness in the deep hours of night, the kindest thing you can do is stop running. Turn around, look at what follows, and recognize that it might just be yourself, calling across time, trying to teach you something essential about the nature of existence and transformation and the thin, permeable boundary between the person you are and the person you're becoming. The story doesn't end. That's the secret Silas learned, the one Margot never understood despite 70 years of trying. Stories don't end. They just change their relationship to ending, finding new ways to continue, new voices to speak through, new hearts to haunt, not with terror, but with the kind of presence that makes you realize you've never really been alone. Not in the deepest forest, not in the darkest night, not even in death itself. The footsteps continue. They'll always continue. That's not a curse. That's a promise. The forest keeps walking, and with it walks everyone who's ever lost their way in the wilderness and found something unexpected. Not the path back to where they started, but the courage to become something they never imagined they could be. Something that exists in the space between heartbeats, in the pause between breath and breath, in the eternal now where past and future collapse into simple presence. And Silas Mercer, who died falling from Eagle Creek Ridge at exactly 9:47 p.m., who merged with his own ghost to become something neither living nor dead but transcendent of both, continues his eternal patrol through the Oregon wilderness, offering what he learned in the hardest classroom of all, that sometimes the footsteps following you aren't what you should fear. Sometimes they're exactly what you need. Sometimes they're just another version of yourself, trying to make sure you don't make the journey alone. The forest remembers, the forest holds, and in holding, the forest transforms. That's not a ghost story. That's not even a death story. It's a story about what happens when you stop fighting the inevitable and start choosing what you become within it. It's a story that's still being written, one footstep at a time in the endless dark beneath the Douglas firs where moonlight struggles to reach, and the only certainty is that nothing ever truly ends. It just changes form, finding new ways to walk, new ways to witness, new ways to whisper to the living. Keep going, keep choosing, keep becoming, because the path forward exists even when you can't see it, lit by the presence of everyone who's walked here before and everyone who'll walk here after, all of us together in the great procession of transformation that some call death but which is really just life learning new steps in the dance. It's been dancing since the first cells split and the first stars burned and the first consciousness looked at the darkness and decided to become a light.